is because it would be really easy for people to say, well, man, that's awesome faith. That wasn't really the awesome faith. The awesome faith comes in the next statement that simply says, God could do this, but if he chooses not to, we're going to be just fine. The things of this world are a part of our lives, and we have to be a part of them. There's nothing that we can do, to change that. Everyday life, things that we like, things that we don't like, and there's so many things that could possibly, and potentially harm our faith. Or I said this morning, sometimes we come up against things where we feel like Satan just punches us right in the nose. When things are going really well and kind of rocks us back, and kind of sometimes makes us think, God, am I really doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Or God, did I miss that? And it just kind of shakes our faith. Faith is a big deal. Faith is a huge deal. The key to faith, though, really comes in learning how to live in it in this world, but not of this world. When the things of this world that do happen don't rock that. Don't change that. There was a story of a dad and a son, and they decided one day to go out in the country climbing on some cliffs. And all of a sudden, the dad heard this big yell from behind him. And his son said, "Hey, Dad, catch me." And so, in turning around, expecting to see his son standing on a cliff about to jump, to his amazement, when he turned around, his son was already in the air. And so Dad caught him, and they fell to the ground, and they kind of laughed there and had a moment, kind of like it was a circus act kind of thing going on, and they could barely talk. They kind of caught their breath, and when the dad kind of found it, in his place where he could breathe enough to talk, he said, "Son, can you give me one good reason why you did that?" His son responded with remarkable calmness, "Sure, because you're my dad." Sometimes you just got to trust. The boy's whole assurance was based on the fact that his father was trustworthy, that he knew that his daddy was going to catch him. Knew so much that he decided to take the leap before he said, "Dad, catch me." That's faith. That's strong faith. Anyone ever here struggled with their faith? Raise your hand. I have both mine up, and if I could get both feet up without falling down, I'd have them up. Seriously. It's something, and Christians, listen, I just tell you, we're all about pointing people to a real relationship with a real God, so you hear me be real all the time. Christians, just throw the mask off and the facade, just get rid of all that junk and just be honest. It's tough sometimes, isn't it? Things happen, in our lives or our families' lives or in friends or, situations or whatever, and it just absolutely rocks our faith. Today, we're going to look at a very well-known Sunday school story, at least one that I remember very well from my youth days in class with Dorothy Burke and Nadine Letzinger as my teachers. And it's just one of those stories, that you mentioned Sunday school stories. It's one of them. And it's the story of three guys with very weird names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm so thankful that my parents didn't name me one of those three names. I really, really, really am, But, the story here that we're going to talk about, in your book, the story, of course, is in chapter 18, but in the Bible, it's found in Daniel chapter 3. There's this king, and King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's kind of a high and mighty thinking, lofty-minded, better than all. Anyway, so he decides one day that he's going to make this huge statue, this idol. This thing is massive, okay? And so he makes this, and he issues this decree or this order, and it basically says this. He said, "We're going to play some music sometime, throughout the day. And when people hear that music, you're going to bow down and you're going to worship this idol. And if you don't, I'm going to throw you into this huge, hot, blazing, fiery furnace." That sounds pretty radical, but that's what he wanted to happen. So some of the king's high and mighty people came to him because they'd heard about these three dudes that that weren't exactly following what the king had issued the decree on. They wouldn't bow to any idol, and so they went to the king, and they said, hey, Neb, these three guys, man, they're not doing what you're asking them to do. And so, this absolutely infuriated the king. I mean, he was hot, and he sent for him, and he said, bring them here. And so they went, and they brought him there. And so the king basically gives them another chance, and he says, okay, guys, listen, this is the deal. When you hear music playing today, you're going to bow down to this idol, and you're going to worship this idol. And if you do that, man, I'll overlook all this other stuff, man. Everything will be just like it's fine. But if you don't, he told him, he said, man, it is into the barbecue with you. And nobody, not even your God, is going to be able to save you. And so that brings us up to this point in the story. And the next three verses are just an amazing, to me, response that shows true faith. True faith. In verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. He will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Now, I want to finish the story. I'm just going to read the rest of the story out to you. Maybe today you're here for the very first time, and this is the first time you're hearing this story, and you're thinking, man, that's kind of crazy extreme there. Somebody, wanting to throw somebody in some big fire just because they won't bow down to some, big old gold statue, when the music's playing, all that. So let me finish the story. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Verse 21, so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, O king. Verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them, the high and mighties. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Verse 29, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against their God be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And then the king promoted them in the province of Babylon. I want to tell you a story really quick. I'm going to share a couple of very bold and graphic illustrations. Now, these aren't local illustrations, so don't think this is about people. I felt like this topic was so, kind of touchy and so strong that I didn't really, because I could share some. So a couple of the illustrations that I'm going to, now they're real. They're not made up or phony. These are real illustrations about real people. But I really want you to pay close attention to the couple that I'm going to share today. The first one I want to talk about is, there's a couple by the name of Larry and Lucy Parker. And they wrote a book one time called We Let Our Son Die. And it's a very tragic story because their son, when he was young, developed diabetes. And during this time and during this prognosis and all this stuff, I mean, they were Christian people. They had faith in God, and the church they went to, the people around, I guess, it was all, they believed in God, had faith in God. Well, they believed at that time that, this is no big deal. We're just going to believe for God to heal our son. Now, there's nothing really crazy about that at all because, I believe today. Now, listen, I want you to know I believe that God is still a God that heals. I don't want you to take anything that I say today to be anything any different because I believe in it. I've seen it. I've watched it happen. So I know. But this family, they kind of began to swing really extreme into one way. And they wouldn't even go to the doctor. And this was a very early diagnosis and something so, simple. However, it was an aggressive form of diabetes, according to how I perceived the story. And so as time went on, and it was not a real long period of time, but as time went on, their son got sicker and got worse. And there were things that could have helped him, but they stood on their faith that, we believe God could heal him. And we're not, that's what we're going to stand on. And before long, their son slipped into a diabetic coma. And then, of course, before long, he died. Now, that's tragic enough, but then in their book, they tell the story that at this time, they didn't have a funeral service. They had a resurrection service. And they continued to stand on the faith that, God said he would heal. I have faith that God. Now, I kind of misspoke there. God didn't ever tell them that he would heal him. They stood on faith believing that that's what God was supposed to do. And so for one solid year, they believed that God was going to raise their son from the dead. Now, eventually, they were actually arrested and prosecuted for the death of their son. It's a tragic story. But even more tragic is that countless other stories like this, they could be painfully retold. You say, well, wait a minute, Pastor Ron, aren't you supposed to have faith, about things that big? Once again, please do not misread what I'm going to speak to you today. But a flawed concept of faith that inevitably leads to the opposite outcome that we believe will happen has a potential of completely rocking your faith. I want to share some things today, and because many Christians believe that the Bible teaches that faith is confidence in an outcome. And that is not true. Confidence in what we believe is supposed to happen. And that's not true. At least that's not the way that I read that. Sometimes we look at the Bible and look at all the miracles that God did and that Jesus did, and we look at the great faith of these men and women in the Bible and what happened because of their unwavering confidence in a certain outcome. Sometimes there was that outcome in the Bible, but it wasn't always that way. It wasn't some, I liked what Adam and I have conversations every week about what I'm going to speak about or what he's going to speak about or what we're doing. And it's like sometimes, and he kind of shared this, it's like sometimes we make God to be a genie in a bottle. And it's like we pick up this bottle when we need something or we want something and we rub on that bottle and we expect, poof, here's God to grant us the wish that we think needs to happen. And we call that faith. But that's not exactly true. Daniel 3 once again tells this story of these three guys. And they stood up to this king because they believed in God. They served God. They knew God. God had already done amazing things in their life. They had strong faith in God. And they stood to the point of being willing to be thrown into this fiery furnace because of that faith and their unwillingness to bow to a false god. They did not pretend to know what was going to happen to them. They were very bold in it. And they said, we get it. You're going to throw us in? Listen, and this is my paraphrase, but they said, you throw us in there, we know our God, he take care of us. He can for sure take care of us. No big deal. They had no desire to burn. They had no desire to die. In fact, at one point, even in saying that, they didn't know what the king was going to do. They didn't know if their words were going to keep him from actually throwing them in or not. But regardless, they didn't waver in the fact that they said, listen, we know God could rescue us. the really cool thing about this, because it would be really easy for people to say, well, man, that's awesome faith. That wasn't really the awesome faith that I want to talk about today. The awesome faith comes in the next statement that simply says, God could do this, but if he chooses not to, we're going to be just fine.
Let's put our hands together this morning.
We hope you are enjoying this week's message. CPC is a viewer-supported ministry. Online, we can be found at cpcava.org. There, we have multiple resources to connect you with our church, as well as a safe and secure way to support this program. Thank you for your contribution.
Get that? I know God can do it, but if he chooses not to, we're going to be just fine. And in fact, we're not only going to be just fine, but he'll protect us from you. He'll deliver us from your hand. We won't bow down. Sometimes we look at those words, and I'm serious, because we talk, this is going to shake some people. This shook me. Because we might say, oh, no. You know, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know, you're supposed to believe and not doubt, and you're supposed to believe and not, you know, all of this. Listen, don't misinterpret this. They believed. There was no doubt. They did not doubt the fact that God could save them from this furnace. But more than that, there was no doubt in the fact that even if that was God's will, it was all going to be okay. Today I want to look at a couple things about faith specifically. Looking at what is faith, and one way to get a better picture of this, and I want to look at a couple things that faith is not. Okay? Just really quickly, I want to look at a couple of things that faith is not. Number one, faith is not trust in our belief. Faith is not trust in our belief. Or in other words, faith is not faith in faith. Faith is not faith in faith. Let me explain. So many times Christians in our circles, we link the effectiveness of our faith to how strongly we can convince ourselves that there will be a positive outcome to a particular situation. Sometimes we work so hard at trying to convince ourselves. So stay with me. Some Christians go through rituals to convince ourselves that we have to pump up our faith so much and enough for God to honor our desires. And a lot of times we'll do this by singing more, praying more, serving more, going to church more, giving more. God, I've given more. God, I haven't missed a Sunday in 5 years. So I know you're going to hear me. I know, God, that, and it's like we try to raise our status in God's eyes, or raise our status on this Christianity level to this point where there is no possible way that God would not answer my prayers. I'll tell you the second story this morning, and I'll withhold names even though it's not local. But there was a story of a young husband and a father, and he had a wife and 3 preschool kids, and he became very ill with Hodgkin's disease. In fact, this was the second time he'd had this disease, and he conquered it about 5 or 6 years prior to this point. He was told by his side of the family, and once again, this is a man of faith, a man that loved God. But he was told by his side of the family, very stringently, that he just needed to have faith again, and the disease would go away. That doesn't sound too crazy to me, honestly, I'll be honest. But the disease didn't go away. He didn't go to the doctor, he didn't go through none of that stuff. It spread throughout his body, and it just got worse and worse. And all the while, the man was told that he just didn't have enough faith. This was his family telling him, man, you just don't have enough faith, man. You got to grow your faith. If you grow your faith, this disease would leave. If you just, pump up the faith guns just a little bit, that you'll be just fine. If you could just exercise that more. It was a dreadful thing to watch, and this man eventually succumbed to this disease, and his family was crushed. And even after his death, suggested that this man died because he did not have enough faith. I know men and women of faith that go to meet Jesus all the time. Bad things happen. Tough things happen. Servants of God, servants of their community, people that lead other people to Jesus, that preach, that sing, that serve, that give. I know that. It's life. Jesus said, in this life, you will have trouble. In this life, stuff's going to happen. In this life, there's going to be times that you're going to stand in front of a fiery furnace, somebody threatening to kick you in it, or somebody that actually does toss you in it. That's going to happen. But take heart. Have faith. Even in those times, have faith. True faith is not having faith in faith, it's having faith in God. Having faith in God. God's ways are not always our ways. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't have faith in faith. They just had faith in God. They didn't trust their belief. They trusted God. If he does it, I believe he can, great. If he doesn't, great. He's got me no matter what. The second thing, faith is not, it is not trusting what we want or what we think should happen. Faith is not trusting what we want or what we think should happen. Although we may begin to see that faith is an expression of this utmost confidence in God, it is possible still to believe that God should do what we think he should do. And I know that we all relate to this because we prayed those prayers. We've had those thoughts because of certain situations and certain people and certain circumstances. God, I believe this should happen. This person should get that job. This person should be healed. This person this person that. It just happened that way. Have we ever found ourselves trusting God to do some very spiritual thing that we have decided that he needs to do? I'll be honest, I have. I'm thinking, man, this just lines up. We all begin counting on what we would love to happen simply because we think it is God's best interest to make that happen. But the results that we desire, or, we say for God's sake or for what we think will benefit another person, we're convinced that this has got to happen. You pray for that job. You pray for that job. I mean, come on, the job you're in is awful and this opportunity comes in and you're like, this is it. God, this is the one, God. And you fill out the application and you get the interview, and I mean, you just smoke it, and you come out thinking, this one is mine. And I mean, everything's feeling great, and then you don't get the call. Or maybe you get a call that says, you did awesome, you did great, but we just had to go this direction. And you're like, but God, this was it. I prayed. I've done what you've asked me to do, and this opportunity, you missed it. Maybe we pray for that someone to be healed, and that person doesn't receive the healing that we prayed for. And we just knew we had the faith for it. We said, my God, I had faith. I believed. And you said if I had faith and believed, and I asked. Just knew. But it just didn't happen that way. You prayed for your spouse, for your marriage that was shaken, and to the point, you're just like, man, I just know God's going to fix this. I believe he can fix this. I believe that it can happen. And you pray and you believe and you go to church and you do all these wonderful things and you're trying, and for some reason it just doesn't happen. I mean, we want that, and you know what? Those things aren't bad things, are they? Those aren't things that necessarily we're asking God that, God could say, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, seriously. Sometimes I think there's some things prayed that really, in the whole scope of things, I mean, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but, sometimes that, this is real stuff. God healing people, God healing marriages, life change that's positive. I mean, that's good praying right there. That's stuff worth praying about, but it just doesn't happen. You pray to believe for maybe an addiction to leave you, but you wake up every day battling the same feelings and temptations. I know that one. I get that one. It's hard, but it's real. And you're like, but God, I believe in you. I know you can. But why? Why do I wake up with these feelings? Why do I go to bed with these feelings? Why? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they did not have faith that said God should act in a certain way. They didn't, remember? They said God could do it, but if he chooses not to, we're going to be okay. I challenge you to go home and read Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Fame chapter on faith, and you look at the people that are listed and you go study their lives. These were people of God that did awesome and amazing things, but guess what? They had tough stuff happen in their life, and their faith wasn't wavered. Not a bit. So really quickly, what is faith then, Pastor Ron? Simple. Trusting in God. It is that simple. Faith is trusting in God. True faith lets God be God. Sometimes we don't like that because it doesn't line up with us. But it doesn't depend on our efforts. It doesn't depend on how much we do or how much, this. It doesn't depend on that, or our view of what God should or should not do. It's just simply resting upon the truth that God is God and we can trust him. This is one of the simplest, coolest illustrations I think God has ever shown me. Faith in God is like taking a blank sheet of paper, handing it to God, and saying, write my story. And I'll do the best I can to live it. That's faith. Because a lot of times we might hand that paper to God and then he hands it back and we read it and go, hey, chapter 2, verse, whatever, that doesn't fit me and I really don't want to go through that and, or that's going to be too hard and, but God, that's not really what I am. I'm really comfortable here and, can we take out line 4? Seriously, don't we do that? Here's my story. Write it. And then do the best we can to live it. That's faith. That's faith. No matter what. It's loving and following him even when everyone else seems to think there's no reason to. True faith is not rocked when life throws you a curve. When you get that call that no one wants to get, or when you don't get that job you prayed for, or if your marriage falls apart, or your family falls apart, or you fall into temptation, listen, when you're thrown into that fire, it doesn't mean that it's over. It doesn't mean that God has left you. It doesn't mean anything of the sort. True faith is being able to deal with whatever God says and whatever God does. Whatever he decides to write on your sheet of paper. And you can't live on my faith. And I can't live on your faith. This is my story. There's a lot of things in my story over the last 45 years that if I could look back at God and say, God, could we rewrite that? I could probably look back in the last week. In fact, I know that I could. And I could say, God, could we just change that? I messed up there. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of what you are. And whatever that story ends up, that should not rock your faith. Because if God chooses to, then great. But if he chooses not to, he's still God. The true test of faith, one of the truest tests of faith, is when God says no. It really is. One of the truest tests of our faith it's when God says no. When there is no healing or there is no deliverance, or when the house forecloses or you lose that job, or when your loved one never recovers, and all the while you've been doing the right thing, trying to live and honor God, but at least in our eyes, God says, that's not what I got in mind. That's not what I got planned. I'm sorry, but that's just, but God, I don't see that, and I don't think that should have happened. Well, sometimes it just doesn't. You don't have to be a Christian very long to find out that you'll be in a tough situation. And even though you pour your heart out to God in prayer, the heavens remain silent, and God's answer is no. One of the greatest tests, when there is no miracle. Remember in verse 18, this should be stapled in your mind. Anytime you hear the word faith, it should just be stapled. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, but even if he does not, he can save us, but even if he chooses not to, God's still going to take care